Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS News. We are in the JNS Media Hub here along with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. And it has been an emotional roller coaster here in Israel, here in the Jewish state. 4 bodies turned over by the Hamas terrorist organization on Thursday. We were holding out with great trepidation, with great hope over the last year. They were the symbol of the hostages, the Bibas family, Shiri Bibas and her 2 small children, Ariel, 4 years old, and Kfir Bibas, just 10 months old. Unfortunately, they were murdered by Hamas. Their little tiny bodies turned over in coffins this past Thursday. Hamas, the cruel terrorist organization, till the very end, not even turning over the body of Shiri Bibas, turning over a random Gazan woman's body in a cruel propaganda ceremony there on Thursday. But after several days, Hamas turning over the body of Shiri, positive identification on Ariel, Kfir, and then eventually Shiri Bibas. Just heart-wrenching scenes lining the streets leading up to the forensic medical center there. The Israeli people coming out en masse. Just a heart-wrenching experience here in Israel over the last several days.
Yeah, there's so much to unwrap about this experience. First of all, these were individuals kidnapped from their homes on kibbutz on a Saturday morning. A mother with 2 babies. Her husband was also kidnapped. He was returned last week alive, Yarden Bibas. But then also Oded Lifshitz, an 83-year-old taken hostage. So you see here that Hamas was not attacking military posts and taking soldiers hostage. They were going into people's houses and ripping out elderly mothers holding babies and taking them hostage, right? So that's first off. Then you have the turnover of the bodies, right? The bodies were returned in coffins that were locked without the keys. Okay, when you lock something without the key, basically what you're doing is you're ensuring that nobody's going to open that coffin at the time to see what's inside. Okay, and then they were presented in front of on a stage in front of some big poster that they apparently have money to print in Gaza, showing Netanyahu with like blood coming out of his teeth and stuff like that. It was a really childish, very childish ceremony. And then, of course, when they take the bodies to the forensics labs, they confirm the deaths of the 2 boys. And then they turn around and say that this is not the body of Shiri Bibas, that they had put the body of a random Gazan inside the coffin and tried to pass it off as Shiri Bibas. Okay, and because Israel has the forensics equipment, they determined that it wasn't Shiri Bibas. But, here Israel had returned prisoners in exchange for a body, and they had given up the wrong body in such a dishonorable and shameful pass off. I mean, whatever you want to call this, it was really, really disgusting.
The ceremony also, you had dancing, you had singing, you had parading, you had Gazan children who were in attendance. Just shows you the difference between our society and their society. In addition, you had Israeli hostages who were still being held by Hamas who were brought to the ceremony to witness this. More psychological propaganda, psychological terrorism by Hamas, like giving these hostages hope that you are so close to being freed, also feeding them words to say in front of the cameras, essentially trying to force Israel into a deal to bring them home. And unfortunately, putting these additional hostages through this experience. I also want to make a comment about Oded Lifshitz. He himself was a peace activist. He was part of a group who was assisting in bringing Gazans into Israel for treatment at hospitals. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're right, left, center, if you're a peace activist, Hamas wants all Jews dead. And that's the bottom line.
Right. And then after it's confirmed that this is not the body of Shiri Bibas, then you see all of a sudden Hamas saying, oh, we didn't know that it wasn't the right body, right? It wasn't us. There's another terrorist organization, faction inside Gaza that was holding this body. And then they said it was a mistake, and they asked Israel to give the body of the Gazan back. And then the very next day on Shabbat, Friday night, then they did turn over the body of Shiri Bibas, because you started to see all kind of reactions to this, not just in the Western world, but even in the Muslim world, right? You had in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, people coming out and just saying how dishonorable is Hamas, and how Hamas has turned into an absolute joke and a laughing stock. And even the Arab world now, when they see this, they see how disgusting Hamas has operated since the beginning and how they continue to operate, that they cannot be part of the solution in post-October 7th reality.
And people need to know out there in the world that these little boys, these babies, they were murdered by Hamas. They were strangled to death. Hamas murdered them with their bare hands.
Right. They tried to say that they were killed in an Israeli airstrike, but the forensics proved that they were not killed in an airstrike. They were not shot. They were strangled to death. They were mutilated with human hands, and that's how they were killed.
Yeah, and the Israel haters will do everything in their power to try to make it out like Israel. First of all, regardless of how they were killed, once Hamas came into their home on October the 7th, 2023, anything that happened from that point on was the responsibility of Hamas. And the haters out there, the anti-Israel folk out there, they'll do everything in their power to try to make it look like Israel was responsible for their deaths. But ultimately, and no doubt about it, Hamas was responsible from that point on. So just a very, very difficult roller coaster emotionally for Israelis, what we've seen the last several days. And then you had on Saturday night, you saw the images again, another Saturday where you had scenes of joy as 6 hostages returned to Israel, 4 who were kidnapped on October the 7th. And then you had the 2 hostages who were held for over a decade. You had Hisham al-Sayed and Avera Mengistu. These were 2 Israelis, both with psychological issues, psychological problems, who climbed over the security fence into Gaza. One, I believe, in 2014, and another 2015, more or less, and being held by Hamas for over a decade. Both of them, in addition to 4 other hostages, returned to their families. And we had the similar scenes there on Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening.
Yeah, you didn't hear anybody for 10 years crying about the fate of Mengistu and al-Sayed. It was amazing. Al-Sayed was released without a ceremony, because Hamas said they have respect for the Arab community, that they wouldn't put them in front of this humiliation, which is basically, on the one hand, is validating the idea that they are simply bringing these hostages up to these ceremonies for the purpose of humiliating them. I think they're humiliating Hamas, to be honest, much more than they're humiliating the Israelis. The Israelis just have so much strength to be able to go through that. Al-Sayed and his family saying, they don't feel that they should have been spared the ceremony any more than any of the other Israeli, hostages that were freed. Mengistu, a black man who was mentally ill. You didn't hear anybody from Black Lives Matter or the like, crying out for Mengistu. And they've been taken to the hospital. They say Mengistu is barely communicative right now, and they're suffering. It's really hard. And we also have Hadar Golden, another Israeli that was taken hostage more than a decade ago. We don't know yet about his status, but good to get back some of these other hostages. We got 6 back on this Saturday night, and that was an advancing of the final release of living hostages in phase 1 of the deal. That's something that Israel pushed for and international negotiators pushed Hamas to do. And now it seems like we're going to be on to the next phase, whether that's some extension of phase 1, whether that is some new phase called phase 2. And there's something like 69 hostages unaccounted for. And the estimates are that at least 30 plus are alive. And in fact, one of these two hostages that you mentioned that were sitting in a car during the ceremony, that was the first time that Israel had seen signs of life from that hostage. So it could be that there may be between 35, 40 even living hostages left. So even though we've gotten back the end of this phase one, there's still a pretty serious hostage crisis at play. Now, we know that, Trump over the last several weeks, President Trump, had been incensed at some of these scenes, especially a few weeks ago when the hostages came back totally emaciated. And we got word that like Wenkert and other hostages were fattened up in the last weeks. They wouldn't look as emaciated as they could have if they weren't fed well in the last week or two of their captivity. Inside Israel, you have a little bit of a different story because you have a lot of Israelis, saying, hey, wait a second. The president is saying, you have a license to break the ceasefire. Why are you doing that? Just go ahead and break the ceasefire and finish the job. But Netanyahu is hedging, and he understands that bringing the hostages back is important to the Israeli society and it's morally the right thing to do. So he's going to be advancing all efforts to bring these hostages home. And we're only hopeful here in Israel that at some point when all the hostages are back, hopefully very soon, then we will see what the next phase, not of the hostage release, but what the next phase of the war looks like.
Yeah, I want to talk about phase two in just a minute, but I just want to finish here. Israel is scheduled to have, unfortunately, 4 hostages who were, it was already announced that they were killed by Hamas, murdered by Hamas in captivity. 4 more hostages scheduled to be released this Thursday. At the same time, right now, here as we're recording, Israel is set to release 602 Arab terrorists supposed to be released. And because of the fact that Hamas did not release the body of Shiri Bibas as scheduled on Thursday, Israel right now has delayed the release of those 602. They were supposed to be released Saturday night. And as of Sunday morning, Israel has not released the 602 out of Israeli prisons. And the question is this really a punishment? Is this a deterrence? What's going on here? Is this really doing anything in terms of, and the logic here is, according to what I've read here, our government is saying, Hamas, you're holding these ceremonies, you're playing games with us. Don't do it again. If you continue to do so, we're going to delay or perhaps not release Hamas prisoners out into society. Is this really going to make an impact, do you think?
Yeah, and the Prime Minister's office put out the statement that they were doing that because of the humiliating ceremonies. And I think that it's a mistake, the language that they're using, and perhaps even the tactic that they're using of delaying the release, for a temporary period. First of all, you have to understand that the Arab culture is one that prioritizes honor and shame as the two guiding forces in the society culturally. So if you're saying that the ceremonies are humiliating, you're actually giving Hamas what they want. They're doing it specifically to try to humiliate Israel. Now, what Israel should be doing is trying to flip that script and demonstrating how childish the ceremonies are, highlighting that in order to make the rest of the world make Hamas into the embarrassment, and not to say that we are the embarrassed ones on the nature. It's a power versus strength versus humiliation trend. It's a theme that comes up in the Arab society, and we have to understand that and use it to our advantage. And the same thing about delaying the return of these hostages, the return of the prisoners back to Hamas for some temporary period of time. What that does is it brings Israel back and Hamas back in this sort of tit for tat. Oh, you did a ceremony, so we can also play games. And I think that what that does is it kind of evens the score in a way that I don't think Israel should be doing. I think that Israel should be using this as ultimate leverage to get the international community and the mediators and others to put max pressure on Hamas to get all of the living hostages back as soon as possible. So if you say that you're taking something which is meaningless, right, you're going to release those prisoners anyway. Is there a difference if you release the prisoners on Saturday or if you release the prisoners on Tuesday and 3 days later? No, ultimately it's the same thing. So I don't think that that's the right kind of leverage to be using. I think it's better be using leverage that is much more tangible, that helps you get something back that you otherwise wouldn't have.
I agree. I don't like these games. I remember for years, Israel would say to Hamas, if you fire one more rocket, they would tell the fishermen off the coast of Gaza, we're not going to let you fish 10 kilometers off the coast of Gaza. You're only going to be allowed 7 kilometers. They would play games like that, and then they would delay, the fishermen from going out for a day or two, and then they would let them go out. And it made absolutely no difference. It would create no deterrent. So I agree with you. I don't think that policy is sustaining. I don't think that will impact in any way, shape, or form Hamas's behavior. But I'm going to go to phase 2 now in terms of where we're headed now with the ceasefire. Prime Minister Netanyahu has made several new demands in talks in the second phase of the current ceasefire, reported by Channel 13 News the other day. According to the news network, a precondition for the permanent end to the war. According to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he is demanding that Hamas leadership be exiled abroad and that Gaza be demilitarized and that Israel maintain security control over Gaza, over the Strip. So these are new conditions. Originally, we were told phase 2 would mean an end to the war, a return of the hostages, and that's it. So now Netanyahu is demanding that once and for all, Hamas leadership be exiled abroad. Do you think this is sustainable?
Well, first of all, this is not a new condition. These are conditions that Israel actually presented as much as almost a year ago. I mean, I interviewed Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer, and we'll talk about him in a moment. But he's been one of the observers to the war cabinet since early on in the war. And in the interview that I did with him, he expressed that this was Israel's plan, for the end of the war, which is the exile of Hamas leadership. At that time, it was still people like Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed De'ef and others. Now, those have been killed, but obviously somebody is calling the shots, including Sinwar's younger brother, Mohammed Sinwar. So it is exile of Hamas leadership. The idea that Hamas is no longer a political or a military force in the Gaza Strip, and that Israel takes over the security control. So these are the original terms that Israel wanted. The problem was that the Biden administration and others were not going to allow Israel to get those terms. Now, phase 2 means obviously that it comes after phase 1. Now, Israel got phase 1 of this deal according to the terms that were laid out by the Biden administration. And I do think it was a big mistake for Israel to rush in to phase 1 of the deal, to get that signed before the inauguration of President Trump. I think that Israel's negotiating position would have improved dramatically had Brett McGurk, who was the negotiator for the outgoing Biden administration, if he had already been out of the picture. Israel should have torn up that entire framework. But I do think that President Trump and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, wanted to get some kind of a win inked before the inauguration. Again, I think that was a mistake. I think that they could have gotten a better deal, right? This is President Trump. His book is The Art of the Deal. The deal that they pushed Israel into was a bad deal. And we've talked about just how immoral this deal is, with the release of, something close to 1,900 prisoners, including those taken during the war and those released from the Israeli prisons. I think that quickly after this deal was signed, that once you started to see these ceremonies of Hamas, you saw how emaciated these hostages were when they were let out, that the President Trump and Witkoff recognized that they pushed Israel into a bad deal. And now what that does is it gives Israel the opportunity to tear up the existing framework for phase 2 and come up with a different framework.
So let's talk about Ron Dermer, Strategic Affairs Minister Dermer. Longtime confidant, perhaps the top confidant of Prime Minister Netanyahu. He will be leading those talks, phase 2 talks in the hostage release ceasefire deal with Hamas. Netanyahu pushing aside Mossad chief David Barnea and Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar. What is the significance of Ron Dermer being in charge now of these negotiations?
Well, first of all, Dermer has been Israel's top diplomat for many years already. As you mentioned, he's been by the prime minister's side for close to 20 years. He was appointed Israel's ambassador to the United States for 8 years and came back. And not only has been a senior advisor, but he was appointed a minister of strategic affairs and became a member of the war cabinet. He's the only minister in the Israeli government that is not an elected member of Knesset. Now, you can appoint somebody to be a minister, but typically the way the situation in Israeli politics works is that you give out the ministries to members of your coalition that are voted into the Knesset. But the fact that Netanyahu would bring Dermer into a high-level ministry on the one and make him one of the few members of a very limited war cabinet shows you just how much Netanyahu trusts Dermer. The two of them respect each other greatly and they think alike strategically. And having Dermer lead these negotiations accomplishes two things. Number one, it makes sure that someone who is of the same mind and thinking strategically as Netanyahu is the one leading the negotiations. This gives Netanyahu a lot greater control over the negotiations. That's number one. Number two, it makes it so that the likelihood of leaks coming out of the top level of the negotiations is greatly reduced. And this was a big problem during other stages of negotiations, even prior to the signing of this phase one. And number three, the previous Biden administration, they wanted to talk to the security chiefs of Israel. You know, they didn't respect Netanyahu. The new administration, the Trump administration, they respect Netanyahu. You've heard Trump say that Netanyahu is a great leader, that he's done a great job running this war. And Steve Witkoff, who is the special envoy that is responsible from the Trump administration for negotiating this deal, Ron Dermer has really connected very well with him. And you have to understand that during these negotiations, you know, Hamas is a terrorist organization. You're ultimately not negotiating directly with Hamas. You're negotiating with Hamas with the backing of the international community. And that means the United States. So in a way, you're actually negotiating with the United States to make sure that the United States is applying the proper leverage. We saw that the Biden administration was never applying the proper leverage. So to have Dermer be the one leading the negotiations, he's essentially negotiating with Witkoff in order to get the United States and the rest of the free world to be putting max pressure on Hamas. And this is the reason why you can hope to expect that phase two of this deal is going to look a lot more just from Israel's perspective than phase one.
So one last point here in regard to Gaza, and that is President Trump's reaction. Number one, he talked about the horrible Bibas murders. He was talking to Fox News. He spoke several times over the weekend. He talked about the murders of the Bibas children and Shiri Bibas. He also mentioned Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying that the Prime Minister has the right to be angry. And he said it was Israel's choice if Israel wants to continue to phase two of the agreement. And he also mentioned, again, his plan in terms of Gaza. His plan, of course, is to essentially have all the Gazans leave the Gaza Strip and basically tear it down and rebuild it up again. We have a clip here of President Trump's comments over the weekend. Let's go to the video clip.
As we wait for 6 more hostages to be returned on Saturday, what do you think should happen with Benjamin Netanyahu, the IDF, and Hamas?
Well, I speak to him, and he's actually not torn. I mean, you know where he stands, and he would like to go in. He just is so angry, and he should be. It's so barbaric. You wouldn't think that could happen in a modern age, but it happened.
You have a different approach. It's Prime Minister, do what you have to do. So he's got the decision to make. Do I worry about the 30-plus hostages that may still be alive, or do I finish off a terror organization that's trying to destroy you? Are you okay either way?
I am. I really am. And sometimes you have to make a decision. You know, it's a decision that has to be made. It's a rough decision. Well, we pay Jordan and Egypt billions of dollars a year, and I was a little surprised they'd say that, but they did. And I'll tell you, the way to do it is my plan. I think that's the plan that really works, but I'm not forcing it. I'm just going to sit back and recommend it. And then the U.S. would own the site. It'd be no Hamas, and there'd be development, and you start all over again with a clean plate.
Right.
Another way of doing it, but I don't think it would work, would be to do it with people there. But I just don't see that working. I mean, it's been so many years, so many decades of killing on that site. That is one dangerous place, and
Right.
Hamas would be there, I guess, depending on what happens over the next little while. But the question is,
Right.
can you wipe them all out? You know, they're so interspersed among people, and it's certainly not an easy thing to do.
Again, there you have President Trump in his comments saying that he believes in his plan, but he is not going to force his plan upon Israel. Your thoughts on the president's comments?
Well, first of all, good that he's saying that Israel has the right to do what it wants to do. You know, it's a different tone than the previous administration, who would never have given Netanyahu the license to back out of an agreement that he made. Trump is giving Israel full license. And even if Netanyahu doesn't take it at this moment, that's still an important message that is sent to Hamas and to everybody else that's involved in these negotiations. I do think, again, that Netanyahu is doing everything that he can to get these hostages back. You know, even if it seems like that's a setback in the overall war gains, Netanyahu, I believe, believes adamantly that you can do both. You can get the hostages back, even if it feels like a bump in the road, and you can still get to this phase 2 conditions that Netanyahu discussed. So I think that, as Netanyahu has stated, you know, him and Trump are very much on the same page. Now, with regard to this plan of resettlement, now this seemed to be the first breath of fresh air that we've heard regarding this war in a long time, that the Gazans would have to leave the Strip. Now, it's not that that is going to be forced on Israel, right? The resettlement of Gazans is something that would be forced on Egypt, is something that would be forced on Jordan, and maybe other countries would come into this deal. If Trump is backing down right now and saying, you know, I'm not going to force Egypt, I'm not going to force Jordan to take the Gazan citizens, well, that definitely hampers the effort to get Gazans out of the Strip. You know, right now it's cold in Israel. It's raining. This is the coldest it's been all winter. This is the most rain we've seen all winter. You have hundreds of thousands of Gazans, if not more, living in tents. It's cold, it's muddy, it's wet. And Gaza should be given the choice to leave. This is what Netanyahu has stated. So the question is, how does that happen? It seems like Trump was going to push Egypt, was going to push Jordan, was going to use the leverage that the United States has over those two countries in the form of financial aid, a significant amount of financial aid. It's not clear now if Trump is going to use that leverage. So we have to figure out if there's going to be some method of getting the Gazans out, whether that is over the border into Jordan, whether that is having them marched across to Jordan, over the border into Egypt, march across to Jordan, or whether Israel will set up some exit point either via the Ramon airport in the south, via the Ashdod port, just several miles north of Gaza, to facilitate Gazans leaving to other countries.
I want to talk about Egypt just a little bit later. It's also very, very important. But just to share with our viewers how crazy of a news week this has been. And any other week, this story we're about to talk to would probably be number one, no doubt about it. A mass casualty bus bombing, series of bus bombings, attacks were averted on Thursday. You had 3 Israeli buses which went up in flames, and another 2 bombs which were discovered on 2 other buses. These were empty buses on Thursday evening near the Israeli coastal cities of Bat Yam and Holon, located just south of Tel Aviv. This was a coordinated, potential, mega terrorist attack, which was averted, thank God. All sources here, from what I have, indicate that terrorists from the Tulkarm area, northern Samaria, were planning a mass casualty attack, perhaps scheduled for Friday morning at 9 a.m. when a lot of people were going to work, or a lot of people headed home for the weekend. And thank God, these parked buses went up in flames on Thursday evening. Again, 3 buses went up in flames, and authorities discovered bombs on 2 other buses. This could have been a mega attack, and thank God, no casualties, and nothing short of a miracle, I would say here.
Completely miraculous. I mean, open, revealed miracles that nobody was killed. This could have been a mass casualty event. You could have had 1,000 people or more killed in these attacks. And how was it foiled? We got word that there was a woman who spotted a bomb on one of the buses. The driver very alertly pulled into a parking lot, got everybody off the bus, and sure enough, just moments after everyone was off the bus, this bomb detonated, and this was not like a little bomb. I mean, you saw the entire bus went up in flames, all the windows blown out of the bus. I mean, whoever would have been on that bus when that bomb detonated would have been killed, instantly killed. That's how big it was. And then sure enough, once that event happened, that bomb was discovered, all bus service was stopped. 2 other bombs, blew up again, just moments after individuals got off those buses. 2 other bombs were found on additional buses. Now, there's actually, some rumors spreading on the internet that this could have been an even larger attack, that there may have been as many as 14 bombs on various buses. That has not been confirmed by any reliable sources in Israel, none of the official sources, but there does seem to be a gag order that's been put in place as to what actually happened over here. So we don't know the full scope, and maybe in coming weeks we'll find out that the scope of this attack is even bigger. But even only 5 bombs on buses, this could have been an event that killed as many people as October 7th itself. So clear that from Israel's perspective, they cannot let their guard down. Hamas is still quite active in Judea and Samaria. They're also active in certain parts of Jerusalem. We've seen that before too. So this war is not over. Even if Israel has the upper hand, there's still significant opportunities for terror, for the launch of some kind of intifada. Had these bombs blown up, I mean, this could have been something horrible.
On Thursday evening, Prime Minister Netanyahu ordering the military to conduct a massive counterterrorism operation in Judea and Samaria. The Prime Minister actually visiting Tulkarem, visiting the troops there on Friday, hours after the explosions on the buses. And saying that the Israeli troops are doing a tremendous job. So the Prime Minister himself making a statement, sending a message in Judea and Samaria, traveling himself personally to these areas, sending a direct message to the troops that we must be there. By the way, let's remember that polls show that 80% of the Arabs living under the PA supported what happened on October the 7th.
Yeah, and support for Hamas in Judea and Samaria at this point is even higher than it is in the Gaza Strip right now. And the Palestinian Authority being seen as very weak, the Palestinian Authority not providing any of the security that they're supposed to under the Oslo Accords, which, I don't even really know why we still talk about them. But Israel still relies on some levels of security coordination with the Palestinian Authority, but clearly the Palestinian Authority not doing anything to prevent Hamas from trying to carry out attacks like this. I think it is very important to note, and this got lost in all the other news, that Netanyahu marched deep into a refugee camp in Tulkarem. Mm-hmm. That's not something that you would see the Prime Minister doing. And if you will recall, he did step foot into Gaza several times during this war, and we see what happened after those visits, that the IDF acted with significant strength and force, and wound up destroying some 70% of the buildings in Gaza. And you have other calls from the security establishment to do the same, and from the right wing of Israel's coalition saying to do the same in Judea and Samaria, where Hamas is trying to organize and is trying to execute attacks in Israeli territory. So, I think important to note that Netanyahu went there. We have to see what will be the results, but we did hear statements from the defense minister, Yisrael Katz, and from Netanyahu saying that there will be massive operations that are going to be launched now in Judea and Samaria. So this could be the next front of the war. And it's a front that we were worried about from the first day, that there could be some kind of intifada launched within Israeli territory, and that Israel would have no choice but to operate deep inside Judea and Samaria, potentially inside Jerusalem, potentially inside some of those mixed Arab-Israeli cities like Lod and Ramla and elsewhere. So, this isn't the end of the war. And I actually even want to come back to a second to this release of the Bibas bodies. Okay. you saw on the Israeli television, Israeli society. I was walking around here, talking to people on Thursday last week, and everybody saying, "This is such a hard day." The TV trying to make it like it's Holocaust Memorial Day with the return of the Bibas bodies. And that's not to say that this isn't a sad and awful thing, but a reminder, the war is not over. Okay. It's not like a year later where we are memorializing. We're in the middle of a war. The middle of a war that is now poised to enter phases that we might not have even imagined. The Israeli troops have been called up again. They may re-enter the Gaza Strip. We may see intensive fighting in Gaza in the next couple of weeks. You may have intensive fighting in Judea and Samaria. You may have fighting in Egypt, and you may have an attack against Iran itself. We're in the middle of a war. It's not time to get sad. It's not time to get soft. It's time to remain firm, remain resolute, and recognize that that we have an opportunity to finish the job in such a way that it will transform the Middle East for decades. If we just get soft now and play the victim card and be sad and try to memorialize what happens before the job is done, we risk not finishing the job. We risk not taking advantage of the opportunities that I think that Israel has an obligation to take advantage of.
On that note, I just got word that media reports indicate that tanks are now present in Judea and Samaria for the first time in years. So Israeli tanks are on the ground. I don't know exactly where, but in Judea and Samaria, perhaps prepared for that operation which the Prime Minister spoke about
and that's
just the other day.
And that's a scarier proposition than war in Gaza, right? October 7th, Hamas, they came across the border, okay? They killed 1,200 people. It was awful, okay? It was an isolated event. The worst massacre in Israeli history, but from October 8th, the threat from Gaza on the Israeli home front was neutralized. It was a one-day event where Hamas carried out their carnage in Israeli territory. Here, when you talk about an operation in Judea and Samaria, you have Israeli and Arab communities peppered against one another in Judea and Samaria without major security apparatus separating one population from the other. It is not super difficult for individuals from Judea and Samaria to get inside Israeli territory. You have these terror organizations also operating inside Jerusalem, in the old city and the eastern sections of the city. You could have a real outburst of intifada-style violence, which could include stabbings. It could include car rammings. It could include shootings, because there's been a lot of distribution of automatic rifles inside the Palestinian territories in the last several years. And there could be improvised explosive devices like we saw here on the buses. So it really could be a very dangerous situation. So it's definitely not time to let our guard down and to think that this war is coming to a close.
Stay vigilant. Absolutely. No doubt about it. Let's turn our attention to the north here. Thousands of supporters of slain Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah have flown into Beirut for his funeral, which will take place today, nearly 5 months after he was killed in an Israeli airstrike. So you have terrorist organization representatives from all over the Middle East, from Hamas, from Hezbollah, from Iran, from all over the Middle East, and perhaps even further, gathering today to pay their respects to this mass head terrorist Hassan Nasrallah. His funeral scheduled for today in Lebanon. What can we take away from his funeral here 5 months later?
Well, there's a lot to take away from this. I mean, first of all, before we even talk about Nasrallah, if you remember, the Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, was killed in a helicopter crash, right? Of which we don't know yet what was the cause of that crash. I mean, they're saying it's an accident. There's definitely rumors that maybe Israel or others could be involved. I don't know if we'll ever find out what happened over there. But when Raisi was buried, and then the new president, Pezeshkian, was inaugurated in Tehran as the new president, you had Ismail Haniyeh, who at the time was the Politburo chief of Hamas, came from Qatar to Tehran to take part in that ceremony. He was assassinated after that ceremony. Right. If you're going to see now people come to memorialize Nasrallah in Beirut in some kind of a stadium in Lebanon. If you're memorializing Nasrallah, you're the enemy. As far as I'm concerned, that event should be a military target. Okay, so we have to see. I don't know that Israel's going to do anything, but as far as I'm concerned, if you're memorializing the worst terror chief on earth in Hassan Nasrallah, you're part of the problem, and that's a military target. Nasrallah, Netanyahu described him recently. I was in a briefing in Washington, D.C. on this most recent visit when Netanyahu met with Trump. And he held a briefing the day after 2 days after the meeting with Trump with some Israeli journalists. And it was described in that briefing by some senior Israeli officials that Nasrallah was the axis of the axis, that he was actually the head general that was calling all the shots for the Hezbollah military inside Lebanon. In fact, that he was leading the entire Iranian axis against Israel. So this is the number one player, and because Netanyahu understood this is the reason why he recognized that he had to order the assassination of Nasrallah. Now, Nasrallah was taken out deep in an underground bunker. He was taken out in that bunker at that time, right before Netanyahu was getting on the stage to deliver his address at the United Nations, because Israel had intelligence that Nasrallah was going to be moving to another location, and that location would have been more complicated for Israel to strike. Israel had the means to strike this underground facility. They did. They killed Nasrallah. But that was months ago, and they've been waiting until now to hold this funeral. I don't know what their motivation is for waiting. I think they wanted to see this drawdown of Israeli soldiers from southern Lebanon. Israel's only holding now 5 strategic positions, but we have to see if Israel gives this ceremony a pass or if something happens here.
It should be a very interesting day, and JNS will definitely keep you updated if there are any developments there. One last item for today. We mentioned Egypt before, and we'll close on this note. The Egyptian military apparently is building up there in Sinai, and the question is why. You had Israel's ambassador to the United States, Yechiel Leiter, accusing Egypt of very serious violations of our 45-year-old peace treaty. Apparently, Egypt has constructed military bases in Sinai, which in his words can only be used for offensive purposes. So the question is, what is Egypt doing? Why are they building up there in the Sinai? Clearly a violation of the long-standing Israel-Egypt peace agreement. What do you think Egypt's doing? Are they going on the offensive? Are they going to target Israel? Is this a move to make sure that Gazans don't start flooding into Egypt? What do you think Egypt's doing right now? Why would they do this at this juncture?
Well, first of all, from everything that we can see, Egypt has been violating their peace treaty with Israel because they've been arming Hamas. I mean, they're
allowing them to smuggle weapons into Gaza.
These tunnels that were going underneath the border, allowing the smuggling of weapons into Gaza, which were used against Israel. The minute the war started, they sealed their border tight to make sure that not one Gazan would be able to get across the border unless they bribed their way out. And you did have some Gazans paying tens of thousands of dollars to get out. This was apparently a major source of funding for Egypt, this border that worked according to bribery for many years. But now we've seen a buildup of military in the Sinai that goes completely against the terms of the agreement. The whole concept of Israel giving back the Sinai in exchange for peace was that Sinai was to be a demilitarized buffer zone. Now Egypt moving troops in, moving military equipment in, and it's not a small buildup. It's a very significant buildup. Don't forget, Egypt has one of the largest militaries in the Middle East. They have something like, I believe, over 200 sophisticated planes. That doesn't mean that they know how to use those planes the way the Israeli Air Force knows how to use those planes. But it's still a formidable army. It's not like Hamas that has Qassam rockets. Okay, they have a military. And I think that part of that buildup is to prevent or deter the pushing of Gazans through the Egyptian border into Egypt. But if President Trump would demand that Egypt take on Palestinian civilians. Remember that Sisi, Mubarak before him, they never did anything to teach their people that they were in a peace agreement with Israel. There's a government-to-government agreement, while the Egyptian street still holds tremendous animus toward the Jewish state. So we talked about honor and shame earlier in the program. It would be a great shame for Sisi, to the president and general of Egypt, to just absorb Palestinians. Okay, the Egyptian street may never forgive him for doing that. And in many ways, it's better from the perspective of honor and shame to launch a war against Israel, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like Iran, and even lose that war, fighting with everything that they have, than it would be just to roll over and fold and allow Trump to push Gazans in there for some exchange of dollars. So this could be, again, this is an issue of honor and shame, and it just may be in Sisi's interest of honor. And it's hard for us in the West to understand this. Okay, right? Because it could be a suicide mission. But to understand, the Palestinian cause is a cause of suicide bombers. It is a suicide mission. They've understood that from the beginning. And it could be that al-Sisi and Egypt are ready and willing to commit suicide. But it's from Israel's perspective, they should not want Egypt to have this military. A lot of this military was provided by the United States, but that military was not built up to fight against Ethiopia, okay? This is a direct threat to the state of Israel. If Israel is really trying to change the face of the Middle East, Israel should not want Egypt to be militarized at all, even though it could be a very dangerous next phase. It may very well be in Israel's interest to have a war also with Egypt, to take out their military, possibly even to take back the Sinai and to push the Gazans away from Israeli population centers into the Sinai area that it controlled between 1967 and 1979.
Well, as we sit here, nothing really will surprise me. If Israel goes to a war on an eighth front, it really won't be a surprise at all, and we'll have to see how it all plays out. But that's all the time we have for today, this week's edition of Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. I want to give a shout out to our production team, Zach Sickerman, Ryan Lifshitz, Yuri Svertsky, Avia Asner, Timur David Aklin, and a big thank you to Josh Landis here, who is in studio watching this week's edition of Jerusalem Minute. Keep it locked on to JNS TV on YouTube, and of course, go to jns.org for all the latest breaking news out of Israel and the Middle East. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS, along with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Continue to pray for the brave men and women of the IDF who are protecting us each and every day, 365 days a year. We'll see you next week here on Jerusalem Minute. Have a great week, everybody.